Welcome to podcast number 22. This week is a audio interview with the composer of Pigeon Impossible, Chris Reyman.
Let's start with a quick background. You've been playing music most of your life, but when did you start composing?
Well, that's difficult to say. I guess I started composing pretty much when I started playing. I just did them both at the same time throughout. First time I ever had anything performed that I wrote, though, was when I was in, I think, junior high. It was kind of a young composer contest thing, and I wrote like a three-part fugue for woodwinds. So that was like the first thing I ever wrote, and then I wrote mostly jazz up until PI, basically.
Okay, cool.
I have done some other. I mean, I've taken classical composition for quite a few years throughout college, but you know, in those areas, sometimes it's not really about writing something that's being performed as much as it is developing a concept. You know, and especially at the school that I'm at now, film scoring is not really part of their composition department. It's not what they consider to be important, I guess.
Right. And what are a few of those differences between writing just a piece that's to be performed on stage and writing a piece for film? What were some of the big differences you ran into?
Well, the main difference is that when you're writing for film, I consider it to be easier because there's something there that's, tangible that you can get into. When you're writing music for the stage, it's very abstract. It's just the music itself is the art, whereas in filmmaking, it's part of the final product.
Right, yeah. And did that affect your approach and how you went about starting, like how you started composing PI as opposed to how you would start a regular jazz chart or orchestral piece or something like that?
Actually, it didn't affect it too much because when I do composing for just a concert or something, I usually try and have a very specific idea. It might even be a character or a character development or some sort of dramatic idea, to create some sort of overall picture for, say, a 10-minute piece. I might have it start somewhere and go somewhere and end up somewhere that would be very similar to the shape of a movie, maybe.
Right.
And it's not coincidental because I love movies, and that's kind of the way. That's one of my favorite. It's my favorite art to appreciate. Really,
Yeah.
I mean, I like looking at paintings, but there's nothing like going to see a movie.
And in a way, it is very true because I was a music major, and that was that was the best thing I could have done for filmmaking because we're dealing with the same language. It's all about tension and release and building stuff up, and it's a very, very similar sort of thing. So that's very insightful.
Yes.
Okay, so let's dig into the actual composing process. So you've mentioned that it's pretty much the same. You've got you've got kind of a visual that you're going for when you're working on, so say that you've got that visual or you've got the movie. What's the next step?
The next step, I guess, would be coming up with some sort of germ, some sort of cell, initial idea that, in film music, a lot of times, most of the music comes from a very small group of ideas, and sometimes those ideas are related in ways that aren't apparent to the listener, to the average listener. And the same thing happens with classical composition, especially newer music, music that's not as tonal. You can take an idea and just flip it exactly around, upside down, and backwards, and it's a totally different idea, and you can slow it down and make it sound completely different, but it's the same idea, and there's something that's meaningful to you that you did that, and you could take it even further and just adjust, every couple notes you're going to adjust one interval up or down. So you're totally changing the idea, but it still comes from the same main idea. And in film music, you can make that as apparent or hidden as you want to make it. So the important thing is coming up with that first idea that can be manipulated in a lot of ways.
Okay. And does that come mostly from research then, it sounded like?
You mean developing the actual idea?
Yeah, and I guess I'm also kind of curious. So with that, like you're talking the germ, are you talking sort of like a main theme? Are you talking more like the, a certain style, like a genre, kind of like you mentioned?
Oh, well, see, I guess that I wasn't even thinking about the genre aspect. That's something that I guess that probably comes first.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you tell me the idea that you have of how you think the music should go and fit with the film and the idea of the film, then I'm already thinking of genre.
Mm-hmm.
With PI, I'm already thinking, James Bond, Mission Impossible, like those kinds of things, and that sets up the soundscape. The sonics, the sounds I want to use.
Right.
But the initial germ that I'm talking about it's not a theme. It's even smaller than that. It's almost like 3 or 4 or 5 notes that will then be built into the main theme. So you take that small idea that's maybe 4 notes long, and then you make an answer to that initial idea, and then that's a phrase, and then you make a phrase that goes with that phrase, and that's a theme,
right,
more or less.
So in PI, you're talking about the dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty much the original idea, and then da 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 da.
Mm-hmm. The call and answer sort of thing,
and then the end of the phrase, and actually when I developed that, I did it very systematically. It was like, okay, well, there's 2 parts of an idea, and then I made the last part the same length as the first 2 parts put together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very systematic way of creating a total phrase.
Okay, yeah. And that might figure into the whole genre thing, because I know it's all based on a blues scale.
Yeah.
So is that kind of where that sort of idea came from?
Yeah, actually, it very much is. I'm not even sure if I thought about it in that way to begin with, but if you think about, a blues song, Since My Baby Left Me, it's that, and then again, Since My Baby Left Me, and then the final idea is the conclusion of that statement. So it's like 2 repeated ideas, and that's the antecedent, and then the consequent is the last phrase. So it's very much set up the same way.
Okay, yeah. Very, very cool. Let's talk a little bit more about the research. Do you like to go in and really listen to a lot, like you mentioned, James Bond, Mission Impossible? I know The Incredibles was also something we listened to. Yeah. Do you like to listen to that other stuff a lot, or do you prefer to kind of get a little taste of it and then, just sort of that way you have a little bit more freedom with where you go?
Well, I listened a lot initially, but that was mostly like, oh, James Bond, I haven't seen one of those in a while. Mm-hmm. So I went and rented about 5 of them and just watched them and listened to how the music interacted with the movie, things like that. And then I would listen to the music more specifically, but when I'm listening to it, I don't have perfect pitch, and I'm not concerned with, okay, this is the orchestra is being used in this way, and this is this kind of tonality, and this and that. I mean, a lot of those things are very intuitive for me. I just kind of can hear that, or I can tell the difference between major and minor.
Right.
A lot of people can, but I'm not concerned with the details of it. I just listen to it and think, okay, I want something to sound like that. And then I spend some time writing something that sounds like that. But since I haven't delved into that specific details of each thing, I'm not too concerned about having it influence me too much.
Yeah.
And having me just copy that idea, because I'm copying it mostly just by the feeling I get from hearing it, or just the general sound of it.
Yeah. So it's almost more like you're establishing the genre conventions a little bit, in that you're just sort of listening to it and you're saying, okay, well, it's almost like they're using music to play off of this. So like, here's kind of more just like the general sort of emotions that they're hitting than it is the actual scales and chords and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess it's almost, I like to think of it as almost just an interpretation. I'm the one that watched it. I'm not writing a text that says, this is how music is used in James Bond movies. It's just like I listen to it and I'm like, oh, I hear something that I really like, the way the interaction happened between the music and the visual. And then I do something that is similar to that.
Okay. Let's start talking about, along those same lines, when you're actually looking at the image and starting to marry and figure out what needs to happen. Could you talk about that process a little bit? Is that something that comes a lot from temp music, or?
Yeah, yeah, it came a lot from the temp music, and it came a lot from your suggestions also. Because when I first went into this is my first experience with film music, so
Mm-hmm.
I was not ashamed to just say, "Hey, what do you want to happen here?"
Mm-hmm.
And the temp music helped quite a bit with that,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that was probably I listen to that temp music a lot, so I'm sure that it influenced me
Mm-hmm.
a lot, and I guess that's probably the main way that I figured out how I thought you wanted it to fit together.
Yeah, and even if, because in several cases the emotion of the temp music was there, but the actual notes and all that stuff was completely all over the place and
Yeah,
all that. So it was
yeah,
more almost translating the emotion of the piece into, or the temp music into your stuff, but just making sure that it
yeah,
fits within our
yeah.
themes and our language and all that sort of
Yeah, I
stuff.
mean, it was almost like the process was, I had a piece of paper, which I guess maybe I should have even looked for it, but it's in my stuff. I just moving, so it's
Hmm.
everywhere. But I had a piece of staff paper that had the themes on it,
Hmm.
and the different ways that I had been manipulating them or used them for different ideas. So I had that on a poster board,
Hmm.
sitting there, and then I would listen to the temp music, and I would figure out a way that music that I could use my ideas to sound like that music.
Hmm.
So that was kind of the process was, oh, here's this idea that I know I should use
Hmm.
during this section because it fits along with what's happening, but it needs to sound like this. And
Right.
so I just try to put those two things together.
Yeah. So let's talk about a couple of other things, because we've mentioned the main, the dun 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 dun, Walter's
Yeah.
theme as we were calling it,
Yeah.
but there were several other themes throughout there.
Yeah.
There was you used a little bit of the James Bond sort of like that slight dun 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 dun, but also the rocket theme I'm remembering now
Yeah.
was something that we spent a lot of time with.
Yeah, there was some confusion along the way between, distinguishing between a rocket theme and a pigeon theme, and that
Mhm.
was also because they're very closely related, and I did that purposefully initially, but then they were too closely related. There
Mhm.
was a problem with that, but I kind of I thought those characters were very connected.
Mhm.
Obviously, I mean the missile was connected to the pigeon, even
Yeah.
though the pigeon maybe wasn't connected to the missile.
Mhm.
But that was a theme that I still think of as being kind of the same idea, though intervallically it's just a little bit different, and rhythmically I tried to change it a little bit.
Yeah.
But those were the two main themes, and Walter's theme had a lot of different manifestations throughout. So it was
Yeah.
almost like that theme had, there was it was used during the opening and the ending. It's a more rock or jazz oriented sound, and then in the orchestral sound was much different.
Mhm.
More heroic, or I think I even used it in other ways, maybe spooky or spy or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, take for instance when I say, okay, I'd like it to be more spookier or more scarier. What is it that you do to get that sound? Is it the instruments that are playing? Is it the harmonies that are going on underneath it? Is it the voicings or the instrument that's actually playing the theme? Or
I think it's all those things. Mostly emotion. I think we relate certain instruments with certain emotions.
Mhm.
French horns are heroic.
Mhm.
As trumpets are, I suppose. And bassoons maybe are a little bit sadder, or maybe those could be even a little spooky
Mhm.
sometimes. Just like when you hear violins playing, a unison or an octave note up high, and that's the only thing happening. That's very suspenseful.
Yeah.
It's just
Mhm.
what we are told by the
Mhm.
movie industry, basically.
Yeah.
But the overall texture, I think, plays into the emotion quite a bit. For something to
Mhm.
be spookier, you can't have a lot of things all happening at the same time. It's got to be very transparent and maybe just kind of still, and maybe some quiet sound like a trumpet in harmon mute doing something quietly that you're kind of like, what is that?
Mhm.
I mean, I think the texture is what I try to use most to convey different ideas throughout.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so we did this actually with two different groups. We recorded an orchestra and a jazz band.
Yeah.
Was your approach fairly different in how you were working on those those pieces for each of the different groups as well? Then.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, the music was not all written ahead of time.
Mhm.
I wrote the beginning and the end first,
Mm-hmm.
and those are related, very
Mhm.
related in the way that I constructed those. And in fact, I guess I no, I guess I did have several themes happen. In the beginning, there's a couple themes. I guess even in the end, there's the rocket theme kind of comes in at some point.
Yeah.
But it was very it was in his adolescence. I really hadn't thought through any of the themes yet. I just wrote the overall theme, and
Right.
and some of that took the little rocket motive and
Mhm.
used it somewhere because I thought, okay, well, this sounds spooky and suspenseful. I'm sure this will come in handy later.
Yeah. Mhm.
And then all the music in the middle was written far after the fact. It was written after we recorded the music from the beginning
Mhm.
and the end. So
Yeah.
so yeah, the approach was extremely different.
Yeah.
And though I wanted it to sound like um, it was all done at one time with one group,
Mhm.
the groups do sound very different. I mean, the beginning and the end uses electric bass and drum set and electric guitar
Mhm.
and a jazz band, basically. And then I
Mhm.
added some other instruments that made it sound more orchestral, like woodwinds and French horn, I think, and strings.
Yeah.
Things like that to try and make it seem more orchestral.
Mhm.
And then in the middle section, it was an orchestra, and I tried to do things that I thought would relate to the things that happened at the beginning and the end. I tried to create rhythmic ideas that seemed more rock or jazz, even just briefly, but to make it seem as if it was fluid.
Right.
And I even, the middle section, one of the parts that I focused on a lot was trying to get the middle section to work, to lead right up to the end, and to work with the music that I had already written. So it was like throughout I was writing music, but I always knew that when I got to the end, I was going to have to try and make that fit with something that I'd already recorded, already written. So that was always something that was on my mind throughout that I knew was going to be difficult, but I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, it worked out great. And the thing that you're talking about specifically is sort of this seamless transition that happens where the orchestra fades out while the jazz band starts playing.
Yeah.
Was that a very difficult thing to actually, when it came time to do that little interlocking section, was that pretty easy because you had prepared so well for it, or?
You mean the actual mechanics of doing it? Or?
Yeah, the mechanics of actually making the two bands play together.
Well, it was the hard part was writing something that I thought transitioned from orchestral to jazz, and you can hear that even at the end of the orchestral, I don't know, maybe you'll probably cue it up for something, or the timing or whatever. They at the end of the orchestral section, they start actually swinging eighth notes a little bit because the last section is swung. But throughout the rest of the middle section, it's all very orchestral, not jazz at all. And near the end, I started using that just briefly. I think it might have even only been one or two different phrases that were kind of swung.
Right.
And things like trumpet and harmon mute. I used that because it has maybe more of a jazzy sound. And I think the very last thing you hear from the orchestra is maybe 3 or 4 instruments, and it's saxophone lead. I mean, the saxophone is very important there because there's lots of saxophones in the jazz band, and the saxophone really didn't have much of a role throughout the rest of the middle orchestral section. So that was just one of the ways I tried to transition to the end section. And then the only other thing was just trying to deal with the timing of it. And so I guess I did that by just having the last note. It was indefinite. It could last as long as it needed to last before the bass came in with the last section. I think that the way that I wrote the ending section made it easy because the first thing you hear is bass, and as long as I have the right chord happening, you could layer those things on top of each other, even though they weren't initially intended to be like that.
Yeah, they won't fight at all. So you mentioned timing just a minute ago. Was how did that work with just dealing with, because that's something that obviously when you're writing a jazz band chart, you don't have to deal with syncing up to picture and all that.
Right.
Did you find that easier or more difficult in that you kind of had a constantly changing visual that would sort of that would influence what the music was going to do? Did that help or kind of?
It wasn't too much of a problem. The way my method, which probably might be archaic now, but I just had a metronome in the video, so I would have an idea of what the texture was going to be. For example, the beginning. I knew that it was going to start at a certain time, and I knew it had to end at a certain time. So I just chose an idea that I thought I liked, and I turned the metronome on and counted out how long it was going to be, and figured out, that's going to be 38 measures or something. And I was like, well, I tried to write something maybe, and if it didn't work out right, I tried to adjust it, maybe make it just a little bit faster, a little bit slower, and see what happened.
Yeah.
And that's the way I did, in fact, all of it. Once I knew the tempo, then I just would count through and make it work.
Which works great until I go and change the picture on you, and then you've got to resync everything. So
yeah, exactly.
And those changes those happen all the time when you're doing film stuff.
That's what the directors usually say.
Yeah, we're jerks. That's just how we roll.
Yeah.
But so how did you deal with those when those changes happened? Was it just a matter of lopping off measures and finding a way to cover in the seams a little bit?
Well, I'm not sure if I can remember any exact moment when that happened, when I had something written and something changed. I think a lot of times I just had drafts of things that maybe I thought would work, and when you change something, it didn't really, it wasn't like I spent days on this, and I didn't have any problems like that. But I think a lot of times, it was just a matter of taking off measures. But to do that, you pretty much have to rewrite everything, because if you write a section to sound a certain way and then you just take off measures, it's going to sound like you just took off measures. Right. So
your phrases are going to get all screwed up, and
it's better just to start over. I mean, you can use the same ideas, but the timing, because it's so important, it's better just to start over and not try and force something to fit in a section that's too small.
Right. And I know the way a lot of film composers deal with that sort of stuff is they tend to use a lot of mixed meter and just constantly changing where it's not even about the phrase so much. Did you find yourself using a lot of that?
Yeah, and in the score, I think you can even see that there's lots of different. There'll be like a whole section in 4/4 time, and then right before an arrival point, right before a cue or something, I'll put a double bar because I know I want the band to know that that's an important spot, phrasing wise. And before those double bars, a lot of times were 2/4 measures or 3/4 or 5/4. It was always like, I was going along, and then I had to make a choice, but it was at the very end that I made the choice. And I think that happened probably a lot of times in the score. Now that I think about it,
yeah.
I don't know, maybe that might be normal. I don't know.
In the film music that I've played, and in fact, I think it's even more chaotic than PI was, in the sense that they're always, it's 3/4, it's 7/8, it's 5/4, it's 4/4. It's just kind of a constantly changing thing.
I guess I didn't worry so much about all these things in the middle of making. I didn't want, he blinks, I want that to match up with the piccolo that comes in. I wasn't as concerned about that. And in classical composition, in that world, everything got very complex. So it was mixed meter all the time. It was It was 17/8, for no reason. And people started realizing, well, can't we just write that in 4/4, but have it be very syncopated? I mean, maybe you could conceive of it in 17/8 or whatever, and then just make it 4/4. And I found myself doing that a few times. Instead of making the downbeat be the arrival, I would make it on the and of 4 the measure before. That would be the arrival that needed to be synced up.
Right.
And then you wouldn't have to worry about a conductor going along in 4 and then trying to figure out a way to do 7/8 or something.
Right, yeah. And the only difficult part about that is that for the players, it is difficult to sort of like, okay, well, the beat that's really important is the and of 1. Have you played film music much before?
No, I have not.
Okay, so you just happily write all those little circles all over the place and figure the orchestra will figure them out.
That's what the accents are for.
Exactly, yeah. Well, and obviously you do a lot of leading into those, so that even though it might look weird on the page, it still feels right. So as long as you're feeling it.
Yeah, I don't think. I would like to say that there wasn't anything that looked too weird. I tend to write, something I realized very early on was that to get something to be played well, you have to write it in a way that can be played. A lot of composers forget about this. They think, well, if I write it, someone should be able to play it. And if they can't play it, they just need to practice more. Well, that's not an option all the time. A lot of groups, if they read it down and it doesn't sound right, they're done. You know, they're like, okay, hand the parts in, that's it. You know, they don't even want to mess with it. So you have to really know the group you're writing for. I didn't necessarily know the orchestra that I was writing for, but I knew kind of the level.
Yeah.
You know?
And that was an interesting situation. So talk about that a little bit, because the Austin Wind Symphony, who recorded the orchestral section in the middle, is actually a wind ensemble that we augmented with a few strings.
Right.
So how did you go about approaching that, where it's, you know, you've got similar things, but it's still a very different group than a classical film orchestra?
Yeah, well, since I hadn't had any experience with a film orchestra, it was easy for me to transition,
Right.
Because it was all new. And I did kind of initially start writing it thinking of it as a wind ensemble, and I used the strings to do a lot of the things that are very string-oriented, you know, those suspended sounds that you hear on top while, you know, you're waiting to see a missile launch or something, you know, those suspenseful things. And there weren't a lot of string players, and I knew that that was going to be a problem, volume-wise. So I really didn't use a lot of strings in exposed parts. You know, I focused mostly on the wind ensemble to do that. So I guess, and that also made it easier for me because I have less experience writing for strings. That's probably the thing I'm weakest at. So that made it a little easier for me to know how to write also.
Yeah, yeah. So how did the end product, how do you think that end product kind of sounded different than it would if you had gone, like if this had been a traditional orchestra, would it have been probably more string heavy?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would have done a lot more strings, or had textures that were more string heavy textures. You know, like a section that was, you know, like a lush string orchestra sound that I knew wouldn't be possible with this group.
Right. Yeah. Let's see. What was the most difficult process, or, you know, the most difficult part for you? Was there a specific section of the movie that was really tough to get right, or?
I think probably the hardest thing was pleasing the director.
The directors, yeah. I hate the director. So yeah, you don't have to worry about that at all.
No, I think the middle section was by far the hardest for me, and I can't specifically remember if there was a part of that section that was the hardest. I think that it was just that it was a large chunk of music. I don't know how many minutes long it is, 3 or something.
Probably like 2.5, two and a half. Yeah.
That seemed like longer. You know, there's a large chunk of music that I had to write for an orchestra, you know, something that I wasn't that familiar with. And I had to make these timings work in a way that I hadn't really dealt with before. I mean, when you first came to me with this idea, that was the scary section, and which is why I wrote the beginning and the end first. You know, that was much easier for me. It was easier because it was a jazz band, and because there wasn't anything that had to necessarily be timed with the visual, just where it ended, basically.
Right.
You know,
so you can kind of get used to your themes a little bit and sort of give those time to sort of grow and develop, and then worry about the scary section.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I know the opening logo is also something that we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
That was quite a bit different from even the rest of the stuff. How did you go about doing that opening logo that we're talking about?
Well, the opening logo and the my favorite part of the music that I wrote, which is the briefcase, the zoom in on the briefcase, and that chord. I think that's probably the best part of the entire film score was that I listened to it and I get happy inside.
It's a nice chord. It's beautifully constructed.
Yeah.
I imagine you spent days working that up.
Well, I think both of those things I wrote probably the day before we played them. I might have worked on the opening logo ahead of time, but you know, the director was not happy with it.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit about, because that's something that you don't have to do nearly as often when you're writing for a jazz band. You don't have to collaborate as much with another person as far as what the final tone is going to sound like. How was that kind of different than working with a jazz band piece where...
Well, I think for me it was easier. It was relieving. It took less pressure off me. You know, the end product wasn't, yes, my name will be there, but it still is something that was for you. Right. You know, that was for the film. So... you know, there are some parts that that you felt strongly about, that I hope that I did in a way that you liked, that I actually don't really like. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I appreciate. It makes me feel good to know that I can write something that, there's something that I was like, well, I think it should be this, but I think Lucas wants this, so
Right.
I'll do this and see what he thinks. And then
Yeah.
you really liked it, and every time I hear it, I'm like, I wish it was this other thing,
Yeah.
But I think that's cool, and it takes a lot of the pressure off. That way, when I'm writing, I'm not as concerned about what I want to hear and what would make me happy to write or make me feel good to write. It's separated from me.
Yeah. Do you recall offhand any of those particular sections that you were like, that you weren't necessarily happy with the final thing, how it came out, or?
Yeah, I think it was right up to where the rocket explodes.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a section that you felt strongly about. In fact, I think you actually wrote some music, like you scored out some music of how you thought it would work, and And that's probably my least favorite part, but I think it serves the purpose that needs to be served. It creates, the whole point was to build this tension that was not going to be resolved directly by the music, and I think it does that.
Yeah. Well, and that's something interesting that you have to think about when you're doing film music too, because the music itself isn't the only part of the soundtrack.
Right.
Because the sound effects also carry in there as well, and the part that you're talking about right there is a big crescendo that builds up to a sound effect that basically resolves that whole cadence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think if there were other places in there. Can you recall any that had those sort of like where you had to work around sound effects that were going on? Or
I think that there was some spots near the beginning of the Pigeon Walter duel that there was some like computer sounds or something that the texture needed to be much lighter in the background.
Right. Yeah. And that was kind of a matter of, texture, but then also kind of choosing instruments and different ranges that wouldn't fight as much with...
exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What was the most fun part of the scoring process for you?
Of the scoring process?
Or the composing process?
I think, the most fun that I had was actually hearing that group play it.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds great on the video, but it sounded great in that room.
Yeah.
And it was, that's probably the most people I've had play something that I wrote.
Okay.
And it was it was an ordeal, and everyone was a little nervous.
Yeah.
And that was pretty awesome, and they did a great job with it, so that made it a lot of fun.
Yeah. And you came down to Austin to sit in with that group for a little while, so I recall there were even a couple of changes that you were making right up to the last minute. Was that basically just because of things you wanted to sound a little bit different than they were, or just, you had kind of envisioned something differently, and because we didn't get a chance to actually hear any of the music before we played it in the scoring session, basically.
Right. Yeah, so, I think, sometimes you can listen to the MIDI files of because I used Finale to write it all out electronically. And you can listen to the playback, and it gives you an idea. You can hear things like, oh, I messed up this chord. That should be a half step lower, right here.
Right.
That was just a mistake, human error or whatever. But there's other things that you just can't hear as well. And then when you hear a group play something live, this happens in a lot of situations, probably every situation, where you're writing something and then a group plays it. You hear things differently, and since we were pressed on time, there were things that just needed to sound more dissonant, or just needed to sound stronger, So it's as simple as telling someone, okay, play all those notes up a half step so it'll sound different than what everyone else is doing, Or just having people double certain parts that need to be stronger, or lay out, or something like that. I think there was even some points where, the initial reading, some people maybe in the percussion, I think it was, got off by a few measures, or did something that I didn't write, but it worked. Maybe not in that exact spot, but they made a sound on something that I liked and wanted to use. And I just remember saying, okay, do that again, but here,
Yeah.
There are things like that you just hear while you're doing it. And that's part of writing for the group. Maybe someone in the group can make some sort of sound that you've never heard before,
Right,
but
yeah.
you know it'll work
Yeah.
somewhere.
And that's something that works very, very well in film music, where you are, it is about that sort of like the emotionality, or, just something that you wouldn't necessarily put into a regular piece. But,
Right, yeah.
Speaking of which, I know film music uses a lot of 20th century techniques. Did you end up using a lot of those? Like,
Well, probably. I mean, I used, that's kind of a broad term, 20th century techniques, and I use those in all the writing I do,
Yeah.
whether it's manipulating cells, or whether it's the way that you develop motives, or special effects, and other sort of chromaticism. I mean, that's all stuff that people just use
right.
all the time now, in lots of kinds of music.
Yeah.
And so I don't even know if I could point to anything directly, but I'm sure that there's something in there. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just thinking in my head, and it's kind of interesting because I remember taking 20th century music, and the funny thing is that a lot of those techniques are used in film music, but it gives off such a specific emotion just because it's been played in those situations before, like whether it's, a 12-tone thing or something that just happens to work very, very uniquely within film music.
Yeah, and also having the visual, I think, helps, because one of the problems that 20th century art music and contemporary art music, one of the problems that I think they have in gaining an audience is that it's so abstract. So hearing those sounds out of the context of something visual, or a story, or a drama, I mean, some of the times that's hard to swallow, hard to sit there and just enjoy and appreciate for the average person, I think.
Right, yeah. Did you come up with any particular... I know a lot of film composers they come up with kind of like a Bible, like a little list of rules that they use. Did you have anything like that would kind of fit into that at all? Or
no, I guess I haven't. I don't think I have enough experience to have my bag of tricks or whatever. That's how I would think of it. But I know specific rules for how certain instruments work and how they work together, and how harmony works, things like that. And I guess I didn't really separate the knowledge that I had with what I was about to do. I figured, an orchestra is an orchestra, or jazz band's a jazz band. I didn't really have any other ideas besides that.
That makes sense. And I suppose you have to have sort of, like you mentioned, you definitely do have a bag of tricks, though, just because you know what those instruments sound like. And even when we're listening to MIDI, you're able to say, okay, well, here's 50 musicians all playing this, and you can hear in your head what it sounds like.
Yeah.
So that's...
In fact, a lot of times hearing in my head sounds better than the MIDI.
Yeah.
I mean, the MIDI is a good way just to do, idiot checking, make sure I didn't mess anything up, transpose something wrong, But if I want to hear, the way it sounds with, like as if someone's conducting it, and people are actually playing it, then it's best just to look at the score and sit in a quiet room.
Yeah. So as you're composing, do you even do that quite a bit? Like when you're watching playback with video, do you even do that same thing where you're not even playing the MIDI, you're just sort of singing it along, or kind of like playing it in your head a little bit?
Yeah, I did that, but I when I did that with PI, I used a metronome to make sure the tempos were right. So I would do it in chunks like that. Because I don't have perfect tempo either.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure I knew that was the most important thing, because I could hear the harmonies, but I can't necessarily hear what 88 beats per minute sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's all the questions that I have written down. I mean, we pretty much covered them. So, do you have anything else that you would like to add? Things that you would like to tell all the aspiring film composers out there?
Don't do it so that I can get more jobs.
Okay.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm aspiring.
Yeah.
Someone needs to give me some advice, I think.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's it. Well, thank you so much for visiting with us and revealing your bag of tricks to the world. So.
Sure.
Cool. Thanks,
Enjoy.
man.
Well, a huge thanks to Chris Reyman for taking the time to sit down and chat with me, and of course for spending all that time putting together this awesome music. So remember that the DVD is available through the website, and I think to close this one off, I'm just going to let the music play out.